The sleet drives horizontally across Drummossie Moor, stinging the faces of 9,000 men standing in 3 perfect lines. It is 1 o'clock on the afternoon of the 16th of April, 1746, and the British Army under the Duke of Cumberland waits with terrible patience. Behind a stone wall on the left flank, a 19-year-old captain named James Wolfe crouches with elements of Barrel's 4th Regiment. His hands are steady on his musket. The wind carries the sound of Highland war cries from across the sodden moorland, a sound that has broken British lines twice before, this year alone. Then it begins. The Highland Charge. Thousands of Jacobite clansmen surge forward through the bog and smoke, their broadswords raised, their battle fury undimmed by hunger and exhaustion. They crash into Barrel's regiment with horrific violence. Men fall beneath Scottish steel, blood pools in the heather. For 10 desperate minutes, the line holds by sheer bloody-minded courage, whilst Wolfe's detachment pours enfilading fire into the flank of the Highland assault. Barrel's loses 17, killed, and 108 wounded more than the rest of Cumberland's army combined. Yet the line does not break. When the smoke clears and the Jacobites flee the field, a young captain stands amidst the carnage, his uniform spattered with mud and blood not his own. He has witnessed the last great Highland Charge on British soil. He has learned lessons that will shape an empire. Yet today, when we remember Culloden, we think of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Duke of Cumberland, the end of the clan system. We do not think of a teenage captain who stood in the maelstrom and took mental notes. James Wolfe would become Britain's greatest military hero of the SPEF, 18th century, immortalized dying on the plains of Abraham 13 years hence. But at Culloden, he was simply an apprentice learning the craft of warfare in the most brutal classroom imaginable. This is the story of that apprenticeship, of how a sickly boy from Kent became the instrument of British imperial expansion, of how the lessons of a Scottish Moor would echo across the Atlantic to decide the fate of a continent, and of why the making of Britain's hero of Quebec began in the blood and terror of Culloden. James Wolfe entered the world on the 2nd of January, 1727, at the vicarage in Westerham, Kent. His father, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wolfe, had served with distinction in the wars of King William and Queen Anne. His mother, Henrietta Thompson, came from military stock herself. From the moment of his birth, James was destined for the scarlet coat. The question was never whether he would serve, but whether his fragile constitution would allow it. The boy was slight, thin, and perpetually unwell. Contemporaries described him as unprepossessing, red-haired, weak-chinned, with a long nose and narrow shoulders. He suffered from consumption, rheumatism, and a catalogue of ailments that would plague him throughout his short life. Yet what he lacked in physical robustness, he possessed in mental determination. Where other boys played, young Wolfe studied military, history, mathematics, Latin, the campaigns of Marlborough and Eugene. He absorbed knowledge with the intensity of someone who suspected time might not be on his side. In 1740, aged 13, James received his first military appointment as a volunteer in his father's 1st Regiment of Marines. The posting to the Caribbean expedition against Cartagena was cancelled when fever struck him down before embarkation, a bitter disappointment that likely saved his life, as disease decimated the expedition. The next year, 1741, brought his formal commission as 2nd Lieutenant in the 12th Regiment of Foot. He was 14 years old. The War of the Austrian Succession erupted across Europe, and in 1742, Wolfe's regiment sailed for Flanders. Here was the great school of 18th century warfare, the Low Countries, where armies maneuvered in. Precise geometric formations and battles were decided by disciplined volley fire. The young lieutenant watched and learned how columns deployed into line, how artillery was positioned, how supplies were managed across hostile territory, the mundane mechanics of warfare that no amount of reading could teach. On the 27th of June, 1743, at Dettingen on the River Main, James Wolfe first heard shot fired in anger. King George II himself commanded the Pragmatic Army, the last British monarch, to personally lead troops in battle. The French, under the Duc de Noailles, attempted to trap the Allied force against the Main. What followed was brutal, close-quarter fighting in oppressive heat. Wolfe's regiment, the 12th Foot, held the center of the line. Around him, men fell to musket ball and canister shot. The noise was overwhelming, the crash of artillery, the screams of wounded horses, the roar of 60,000 men locked in combat. Yet the British infantry stood firm, pouring disciplined fire into the French columns. When the enemy finally broke, Wolfe had survived his baptism. He had also caught the eye of the Duke of Cumberland, the King's second son and commander of British forces. Cumberland noted the thin young officer who remained calm under fire. That recognition would prove crucial. In June 1744, Wolfe purchased a captaincy in the 4th Regiment of Foot Barrels King's Own. The purchase system was standard practice, but Wolfe's advancement owed as much to merit as money. He was developing a reputation as a dedicated professional in an army where many officers regarded their commissions as sinecures. Whilst others drank and gambled, Wolfe studied tactics. Whilst others left training to their sergeants, Wolfe drilled his men personally. The campaigns in Flanders continued. At Fontenoy in May 1745, Wolfe participated in Cumberland's famous but futile infantry assault on the French position. The British battalions advanced in perfect order directly into concentrated artillery fire, a display of courage bordering on madness. The attack failed with horrific casualties, but the discipline of the British infantry became legendary. Wolfe absorbed another lesson. Courage alone was insufficient without tactical advantage. Then came news from Britain that changed everything. Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, had landed in Scotland. The Jacobite Rising of 1745 had begun. Barrel's regiment was among those recalled to confront the rebellion. Wolfe returned to find Britain in crisis. The Jacobite army had defeated Sir John Cope at Prestonpans with shocking ease, then marched south to Derby, just 125 miles from London. Panic gripped the capital. The government teetered. Only the Jacobites' decision to retreat north prevented catastrophe. Cumberland took command, reorganizing the demoralized royal forces. In January 1746, at Falkirk, the government army again faced the Highlanders. Again, the Highland Charge shattered British lines. The redcoats broke and ran. Cumberland ordered a retreat to Edinburgh, seething with frustration. His army needed not just courage but a tactical answer to the Highlanders' ferocious assault. At Aberdeen, Cumberland drilled his troops with unprecedented rigor. Standard infantry tactics of the period involved standing in ranks, firing volleys, and repelling cavalry with massed bayonets. But the Highland Charge was different, a terrifying hybrid of firearms and hand-to-hand combat. The Highlanders would fire their muskets once, discard them, and crash into enemy lines with broadsword and targe, exploiting the chaos before defenders could reload. Cumberland's solution was radical. He ordered his troops to abandon the instinctive, responsive thrusting at the opponent directly in front. Instead, each soldier would bayonet the Highlander attacking the man to his right, where the raised sword arm left the body exposed. It required trust, discipline, and iron nerve to ignore your immediate threat. But if it held, it would neutralize the Highland advantage. James Wolfe drilled his men in these new techniques. He was 20 years old, a veteran of Dettingen and Fontenoy, and he understood something crucial. Battles were won not by elan alone, but by training and tactical flexibility. The Romantics might celebrate Highland courage. Wolfe, ever the professional, calculated how to defeat it. As spring arrived, Cumberland's army marched north from Aberdeen. The confrontation could not be delayed much longer. The Jacobite army, starving and exhausted after a failed night march, assembled on Culloden Moor, outside Inverness. Wolfe and his men marched toward their destiny. Dawn on the 16th of April, 1746, found the government army camped at Nairn, 12 miles from Inverness. The men had slept well, fortified by rum and biscuits issued in celebration of Cumberland's 25th birthday. The Duke rose early and ordered the army to march in 4 columns across the moorland. They were well-fed, well-rested, confident. The Jacobite army, conversely, was in tatters. Prince Charles Edward Stuart's forces had attempted a night attack on Cumberland's camp, but had floundered in the darkness and boggy terrain. Men became separated, exhausted, and discouraged. Many wandered off in search of food or sleep. When the alarm sounded around midday, summoning the clans to their positions, perhaps only 5,000 men answered the call, 2,000 fewer than Cumberland commanded. The battlefield itself was a disaster for the Jacobites. Culloden Moor stretched open and flat between enclosure walls, ideal terrain for Cumberland's artillery and disciplined infantry, catastrophic for the Highland Charge that required momentum and surprise. Lord George Murray, the Jacobites' finest general, had protested the site vehemently. But Prince Charles's Irish adjutant general, John O'Sullivan, had chosen it, and the prince refused to overrule him. That decision would doom the rebellion. By 1 o'clock, both armies stood deployed. Cumberland's front line 7 battalions, Pulteney's, the Royals, Cholmondeley's, Price's, the Royal, Scott's Fusiliers, Monroe's, and Barrel's on the left flank. Behind them in the second line stood 5 more battalions. Blakeney's regiment formed the reserve. On the flanks, squadrons of Cobham's and Kerr's dragoons waited to exploit any breakthrough. Most critically, pairs of 3-pounder cannon were positioned between each regiment in the front line, more concentrated artillery than the British Army had ever deployed in a single battle line. Captain James Wolfe held a peculiar position. Whilst formally attached to Barrel's regiment, he commanded a detachment positioned behind a stone dike that ran obliquely from Barrel's left flank toward the Jacobite lines. From here, his men could deliver enfilading fire across the entire front, shooting into the flank of any Highland Charge. It was a tactical masterstroke, and one that demonstrated Cumberland's meticulous planning. Opposite, the Jacobite army formed its battle line with the Atholl regiments on the right. Then the Camerons, Stuarts of Appin, Frasers, Macintoshes, and various other clan regiments. On the left flank stood the MacDonalds, bitter and resentful at being denied their traditional position on the Fermanagh. Right. Behind the front line, a motley second line contained the small French regular contingents and depleted Highland cavalry. A handful of old cannon were scattered along the line, manned by inexperienced crews. The weather matched the grimness of the occasion. Cold rain mixed with sleet drove across the moor, carried by a northeast wind that blew directly into the faces of the Jacobite army. The men were hungry. Many had eaten nothing in 24 hours. They were exhausted from the failed night march, and they stood on ground that negated every tactical advantage they possessed. At approximately 5 minutes past 1, the Jacobite artillery opened fire. The shots were wild, many sailing over the heads of Cumberland's men. The government artillery responded with devastating precision. Colonel Belford, Britain's finest gunner, directed a systematic bombardment. Round shot plowed through the Highland ranks. Men were decapitated, torn apart, eviscerated. The clansmen had no cover, no recourse but to stand and endure. The psychological torture was unbearable. For 20 minutes, the bombardment continued. The Jacobites could neither advance without orders nor retreat without dishonor. They died in their ranks, watching friends and kinsmen destroyed. Finally, around 1:30, Prince Charles gave the order. The clans could attack. The Highland Charge, when it came, was everything the British had feared. The Macintoshes, known as Clan Chattan, surged forward first, led by their yellow-haired chief, MacGillivray of Dunmaglass. The Camerons, Stuarts, Frasers, and Atholmen followed, roaring their war cries. Thousands of clansmen sprinted across the moor, their broadswords catching the weak sunlight, their tartans streaming behind them. But the charge immediately went awry. An unseen bog lay before the Highland right, forcing Clan Chattan to veer right onto the farm track that ran diagonally across the moor. Other regiments crowded after them, bunching the assault and pushing the entire attack toward Cumberland's left, flank toward Barrel's regiment and James Wolfe's detachment. The British artillery switched to canister-shot tin cylinders filled with musket balls that turned cannon into giant shotguns. The range closed. 300 yards. 200. The front ranks of the Highland Charge were shredded by Crow. Grape shot. Yet still they came. The noise was indescribable. The thunder of cannon, the screams of dying men, the wild ululation of Gaelic battle cries. At 50 yards, Barrel's regiment fired its first volley. Smoke erupted along the line, momentarily obscuring everything. The range was point blank. Highlanders fell in heaps, but the survivors crashed through the smoke into Barrel's ranks with terrifying force. James Wolfe, from his position behind the stone dike, poured fire into the flank of the Highland assault. His men fired, reloaded, fired again with mechanical efficiency. They couldn't miss. The range was less than 50 yards, and the target was a mass of humanity. Wolfe's enfilading fire tore into the right side of the Highland wedge, men falling without ever seeing their killer. But at the point of contact, where the Highland Charge met Barrel's line, the fighting descended into pure butchery. The Highlanders wielded their broadswords with savage skill. Captain Lord Robert Kerr was killed instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rich lost his left hand to a blade, suffered 6 cuts to his head, and nearly lost his right arm. Barrel's color party was cut down. For 10 minutes, it was hand-to-hand slaughter. Yet Cumberland's new bayonet drill worked. Instead of stabbing the man in front, whose raised targe deflected most thrusts, the redcoats targeted the Highlander, attacking the man to their right. With sword arms raised for the downward cut, torsos were exposed. Bayonets found ribs, lungs, hearts. The Highland Charge, which had broken Cope at Prestonpans and Hawley at Falkirk, met a wall of steel and discipline that would not yield. Monro's regiment, to Barrel's right, also held, despite ferocious assault. Cumberland, watching from the center, ordered Bligh's and Sempill's regiments forward from the second line to reinforce the threatened left. Fresh volleys crashed into the Highlanders from the front, whilst Wolfe's detachment continued its murderous enfilade. The clansmen, caught in a killing box, began to falter. On the Jacobite left, the MacDonalds never advanced. Whether from resentment at their positioning or simple recognition of the futility, they stood fast whilst their comrades died. The Jacobite cavalry attempted a flanking maneuver but were repulsed by dragoons and Campbell militia. The Jacobite second line, the French regulars and Irish pickets maintained their formations but could do nothing to salvage the battle. Within 20 minutes of the initial charge, the Highland assault had spent itself. Men began streaming back toward their lines, running a gauntlet of fire from Wolfe's position as they retreated. Cumberland ordered his cavalry forward. Cobham's and Kerr's dragoons swept around both flanks, cutting down fleeing Highlanders. The Argyll militia, Campbell clansmen loyal to the government, pushed through Culloden Park and emerged behind the Jacobite right flank, completing the envelopment. Prince Charles, watching his cause disintegrate, was led from the field by his aides. The clan regiments melted away, their retreat covered by the Irish pickets who maintained formation and marched off in good order professionals to the last. By 2 o'clock, Culloden Moor belonged to Cumberland. The slaughter had lasted less than an hour. Barrel's regiment had borne the brunt of the Highland assault and paid accordingly, 17 killed and 108 wounded, from a strength of perhaps 350. The rest of Cumberland's army suffered fewer than 50. Dead total. The Jacobite casualties were catastrophic. Between 1,000 and 1,500 killed in the battle and immediate aftermath, with hundreds more wounded. Many who fell wounded on the field were bayoneted where they lay. Cumberland's men had no mercy for rebels. In the smoke and confusion, James Wolfe moved among the carnage. Legend claims that Cumberland ordered him to execute a wounded Jacobite officer, Charles Fraser of Inveralochie, and that Wolfe refused, stating, "My commission is at your disposal, but I cannot stain my honor." Whether true or apocryphal, the story captured something essential about Wolfe. He was a professional soldier, not an executioner. What is beyond dispute is that Culloden marked Wolfe's emergence as a serious military officer. He had commanded his detachment with coolness under the most intense pressure imaginable. His enfilading fire had been decisive in breaking the Highland Charge. He had seen tactics triumph over courage, discipline over chaos, and he had learned that battles were won before the fighting began, through training, positioning, and preparation. The battle was over, but the lessons of Culloden would shape the rest of James Wolfe's brief, brilliant life. The immediate aftermath of Culloden was savage. Cumberland's army pursued the fleeing Jacobites with ruthless efficiency, earning the Duke his enduring sobriquet, Butcher. For weeks, government troops scoured the Highlands, burning cottages, confiscating weapons, executing prisoners. The clan system, which had sustained Highland society for centuries, was systematically dismantled. Estates were forfeited, tartans banned. The old Gaelic order was crushed beneath British military power. James Wolfe participated in the pacification, though his exact role remains unclear. He spent the summer of 1746 garrisoning in Scotland, then moved to postings in the north of England. In 1748, aged 21, he became major of the 20th Regiment of Foot and subsequently its commanding officer. For a man so young, this was extraordinary advancement. Cumberland's patronage undoubtedly helped, but Wolfe had earned his reputation. The peacetime years of the 1750s found Wolfe in garrison duty in Scotland and Ireland. These were not idle years. Whilst other officers hunted, drank, and complained of boredom, Wolfe transformed his regiment. He drilled his men relentlessly in the techniques he had seen succeed. At Culloden, rapid fire, disciplined volleys, and above all, the new bayonet drill. He wrote treatises on tactics and training. He studied military history and mathematics. He prepared, though for what he could not yet know. His health remained precarious. Consumption racked him. Rheumatism left him in constant pain. He was often bedridden for days, yet he drove himself mercilessly, as though aware his time was limited. "I had rather die than decline the service when the honor and interest of my country demand it," he wrote to his mother. For Wolfe, duty transcended comfort, even survival. In 1757, Britain's fortunes in the 7 Years' War looked grim. French forces dominated Europe. In North America, British defeats mounted. William Pitt the Elder, recalled as Secretary of State, sought aggressive commanders willing to take risks. James Wolfe, now 30 years old and a lieutenant colonel, received orders to join an expedition against the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Under General Geoffrey Amherst, the Louisbourg expedition succeeded brilliantly in July 1758. Wolfe commanded a brigade and distinguished himself through aggressive reconnaissance and daring amphibious assaults. Amherst noted his energy and tactical skill. More importantly, Pitt noticed, when planning the campaign to capture Quebec, the linchpin of French power, in North America, Pitt reached past dozens of senior officers to select James Wolfe as commander. At 32, Wolfe would be Britain's youngest major general. The Quebec campaign of 1759 would immortalize Wolfe, but its success owed everything to the lessons of Culloden. Facing the brilliant French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, entrenched on the heights above Quebec, Wolfe faced a tactical puzzle, seemingly without solution. French positions were impregnable to frontal assault. The St. Lawrence River protected their flanks. Time worked against the British winter, would freeze the river, forcing withdrawal. Wolfe spent the summer probing for weakness, growing increasingly frustrated and ill. Finally, in early September, he formulated a desperate plan. A night landing upriver from Quebec, scaling the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, and forcing Montcalm to battle on open ground. It was audacious to the point of recklessness. But Wolfe remembered Culloden, how terrain could negate numerical advantage, how disciplined infantry could break a seemingly unstoppable charge. On the night of the 12th of September, 1759, British troops silently ascended the cliff path at Anse-au-Foulon. By dawn, 4,500 redcoats stood on the Plains of Abraham in perfect battle order. Montcalm, presented with the impossible, made a fatal choice. Rather than wait for reinforcements, he attacked immediately with 4,500 men. The French advanced in columns, hoping to overwhelm the British before their full strength could deploy. James Wolfe, commanding the center, held his fire until the French were 40 yards away, the same murderous range that had destroyed the Highland Charge at Culloden. "Reserve your fire until you can see the whites of their eyes," he ordered, though whether he actually spoke those famous words is debatable. What matters is that his troops obeyed with Culloden-trained discipline. The British volley, when it came, was devastating. Musket balls tore through the French columns. Before the smoke cleared, Wolfe ordered, "Charge!" The redcoats advanced with bayonets, the same drill perfected 13 years earlier on a Scottish moor. The French line shattered. Within 15 minutes, the battle was decided. Wolfe did not witness the full victory. Early in the engagement, he was shot in the wrist. He wrapped it hastily and continued. Moments later, another musket ball struck his groin. He fell but rose again. Then a third ball hit him in the chest, above the heart. His men carried him to the rear, blood soaking his scarlet coat. As he lay dying, an officer cried, "They run! They run!" Wolfe, consciousness fading, asked, "Who run?" "The enemy, sir," came the reply. Wolfe's final recorded words were, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He was 32 years old. The death of Wolfe became Britain's most celebrated military sacrifice. Benjamin West's famous painting, exhibited in 1770, immortalized the moment with classical grandeur. The canvas shows Wolfe expiring in a pose reminiscent of the deposition of Christ, surrounded by grieving officers and a lone Native American warrior, a romantic fiction, but one that captured the nation's imagination. Wolfe became the martyr hero of British imperial expansion, the symbol of courage and duty. Yet the true legacy of James Wolfe lies not in romantic paintings but in the professional transformation of the British Army. His tactical writings, published posthumously in 1768 as instructions to young officers, codified the lessons he had learned from Dettingen to Culloden to Quebec. He emphasized training over tradition, merit over purchase, and tactical flexibility over rigid doctrine. The British infantry of the Napoleonic era, Wellington's legendary redcoats, were heirs to Wolfe's reforms. Why, then, is Wolfe forgotten at Culloden? Perhaps because the battle represents an uncomfortable chapter, the crushing of Scottish identity, the brutality of imperial consolidation. Culloden carries no glory for British nationalism. It is a victory, best left uncelebrated. And so we remember Wolfe at Quebec, dying heroically on the cusp of triumph, and forget the 19-year-old captain learning his trade amidst Highland corpses. Yet, Culloden shaped everything that followed. There, Wolfe learned that battles are won by preparation, not improvisation. That discipline defeats courage when courage lacks tactical intelligence. That terrain, timing, and training matter more than numbers. These lessons, absorbed in blood and smoke on a Scottish moor, would echo across the Atlantic to the cliffs of Quebec. The Jacobites were doomed. Regardless, their rebellion lacked political support in England, logistical sustainability, or realistic prospects of French intervention. But Culloden demonstrated how they would be defeated, not through romantic heroism but through professional competence. James Wolfe was the embodiment of that. Competence. James Wolfe lies buried in Street Alphege Church, Greenwich, not in Westminster Abbey among kings and admirals, but in the parish of his childhood. His parents rest beside him. The monument is modest, as Wolfe himself would have wished. He was never knighted, never ennobled. The glory came posthumously, and he would likely have found it embarrassing. Culloden Moor today is a haunted place. The National Trust for Scotland maintains the battlefield with scholarly precision, marked stones indicating where each clan stood, walking paths tracing the line of attack. Visitors come by the thousands, drawn by the tragedy of it all. They remember the Jacobites, the lost cause, the death of Highland culture. Few think of the young captain behind the stone dike, learning the craft that would win an empire. History has a curious way of selecting its heroes. Wolfe at Quebec is immortal, the young general dying in the moment of victory, a narrative perfectly calibrated for legend. Wolfe at Culloden is simply a soldier doing his job, one among thousands. There is no painting of that moment, no stirring song, just a teenage officer in the mud and rain, watching men kill each other and taking further notes. Yet the apprenticeship mattered more than the masterpiece. Quebec was Wolfe's triumph, but Culloden was his education. There he learned that war is decided not by elan but by logistics, not by courage but by coordination. He learned to trust discipline over heroics, preparation over providence. And he learned that the British Empire would be built not by romantic cavaliers, but by professional soldiers who understood their trade. The forgotten heroes of British history are often those who did their work too well to require mythology. Wolfe at Culloden was simply competent, precisely, devastatingly competent. That competence would shape the 18th century more profoundly than any number of Bonnie Prince Charlies could dream. Standing on Culloden Moor today, one can still see the stone dike where Wolfe's detachment waited. The landscape has changed. Little. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear it. The wail of pipes, the crash of musketry, the screams of dying men. And perhaps, if you listen carefully, you can hear the quieter sound beneath the chaos, the sound of an empire being forged, one disciplined volley at a time. James Wolfe would die at 32, his body ravaged by consumption and war wounds. But in those brief years, he helped remake British military culture from an amateur's pursuit into a professional calling. His legacy lives on, not in statues or ceremonies, but in the countless officers who studied his instructions, absorbed his emphasis on training and merit, and carried British power to every corner of the globe. We remember Wolfe as the hero of Quebec. Perhaps we should remember him as the apprentice of Culloden, the young man learning amidst horror that professionalism conquers chaos, that discipline defeats desperation. For that lesson, taught in Scottish blood on a cold April afternoon in 1746, would echo down the corridors of military history for 200 years. The forgotten heroes are often those whose lessons we still live by, though we've forgotten where they came from. James Wolfe at Culloden Moor, 19 years old, sickly, unromanticized, unremarked, was one such hero. The empire he helped build has long since faded, but the professionalization of warfare he represented endures. And that, perhaps, is legacy enough.